Interestingly enough, I'm a little critical of Merrill for two reasons. One, I trained there and it was a fine firm when I trained there 30 years ago. I hated to see what happened to it. Secondly, Merrill deals with mom and pop. If Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers want to screw each other, I don't care, okay? But when it comes to dealing with 80-year-old widows' trust funds, I believe it needs to change. Interestingly enough, the Financial Times in its article, The Future of Capitalism, just interviewed the head of Merrill Lynch in Moscow. Get this, he said, "Our world is broken and I honestly don't know what's going to replace it. The compass by which we steered as Americans has gone. The last time I saw anything like this in terms of disorientation and loss was among my friends in Russia when the Soviet Union broke up." The collapse of Bear Stearns was to America what the collapse of the Berlin Wall was to the Soviet philosophy, if you will. Nouriel Roubini is probably the most quoted economist on Wall Street today because he predicted all this mess in the subprime crisis and the banking institutions and so on. Told the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago, at some level it's good to have a framework to think about the world in which you emphasize the role of incentives in market economics. People are self-interested. But I think it led to an excessive ideological belief that there are no market failures and no issues of disorientations of incentives. Also, central banks were created to provide financial stability. Greenspan forgot this, and that was a mistake. I think there were ideological blinders taking Ayn Rand's view of the world to an extreme. You understand what he said? Most quoted economist today says the mess we're in is Ayn Rand's worldview, her non-Judeo-Christian worldview. Get this, in this new series, The Future of Capitalism, the Financial Times has said, another ideological God has failed. Government's bad, deregulated markets good. How can this faith escape unscathed after Alan Greenspan, pupil of Ayn Rand and predominant central banker of the era, described himself in congressional testimony last October as being in a state of shocked disbelief over the failure of the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity. The rational, self-interested leader of a bank, okay, should not kill the golden goose, right? But Judeo-Christian philosophy has always said human nature is not quite that good, Alan and Ann, okay? Have you ever noticed that we sometimes quote Adam Smith's bakery as how self-interest serves the world, and it's true, but have you ever noticed that bakery goods aren't delivered in armored cars? That's money. Judeo-Christianity has always said money brings out the worst in human nature. And some of those guys on Wall Street, if you give them room, are just going to steal you blind. How many of you here would start a small business and say, I'm going to own it, own the shares, and Bill, I'm going to hire you. And you make all the decisions, pay yourself whatever you want, and take care of my business. And I'll be back in a couple of years to see how much money you made me. Would anyone in their right mind do that? I just described American capitalism as it's existed for 30 years, and it was supposed to work. Now, the interesting part is you would think with all this mess and everybody, all the minds in the world understanding it, that this religion would disappear. Economist magazine on February 28th talked about how the crisis had caused a spike, another spike, in the sale of Atlas Shrugged. It has sent business leaders back to say, hey, it wasn't really my worldview that caused this, and I need reassurance from Ayn Rand. It would be like the guys who go to prison suddenly getting interested in the Bible, like Jim Bakker did, the televangelist. He spent his time reading the Bible and said, boy, I messed up. Okay, same thing. It's not going to die, guys. Just last week, the head of the Ayn Rand Institute wrote in the Wall Street Journal that she died a quarter of a century ago, that her name appears regularly in the discussions of our current economic turmoil. Pundits, including Rush Limbaugh and Rick Santelli, urged listeners to read her book, and her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, is selling at a faster rate than at any time in 51 years. He complained, the message is always the same. Selfishness is evil, sacrifice for the needs of others good. But Rand said this message is wrong. Selfishness, rather than being evil, is a virtue. It's still being preached. I wrote an editorial to the Wall Street Journal contrasting her thinking with, when I read this, with that of John Templeton, and I said, which would you rather do business with? John Templeton, the honored, respected financier, or the young Michael Milken before he went to jail? I believe there's an opportunity, a historic opportunity to change things today, but we're going to have to understand. And what I'm afraid of, George Barna, if you listen to him, says the new religion of America, he said, never believe America's not religious. The problem with America is it has too many religions. It takes a little of this religion, a little of that religion, and so on. I happen to believe the predominant religion in America is Christianity on Sunday and Ayn Rand Monday through Saturday. Okay, it's called syncretism that we talked about. Ravi Zacharias, in a book called Jesus Among Other Gods, said wealth and enterprise have so woven themselves around the message of Jesus that popular models of Christianity appear as nothing more than self and greed at the center, with strands of Christian thought at the periphery. Alan Greenspan wrote in the Journal last week, he said, the Fed didn't cause this housing bubble. All things considered, I personally prefer Milton Friedman's performance appraisal of the Federal Reserve. Okay, Milton Friedman said they got the monetary policy okay. He did not mention the part about deregulating the Wall Street firms. You should know when Alan Greenspan took a break from government, he spent his time, in essence, deregulating the savings and loan industry back in the 80s. You might remember a guy named Charles Keating, Lincoln Savings and Loan. So Greenspan has now done this twice, and he still doesn't get it. Professor Ravi Batra has written a book called Greenspan's Fraud, in which he wrote, the picture that emerges is one of an intelligent man centered on the self. More than anything else, Alan Greenspan seems to take care of Alan Greenspan. His life and accomplishments turn out to be a fitting monument to Ayn Rand's philosophy of rational selfishness.